Welcome to TrineDay's Roundtable 31, Striving for Unified Solutions, JFK's Vision of Peace, Henry George's Economic Justice, and Expanding the Narrative. I am Bruce the Taurus, moderating. Our special guest, Frank Holder, author of This Day in Comedy, the Ethnic Encyclopedia of Laughter, unfortunately cannot be with us. We look forward to rescheduling him at the earliest opportunity. Today, we are going to hear from publisher and host Kris Millegan, and then authors and journalists Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould, expanding on the narrative creation process. The last half will be open discussion, questions and answers. And now our host, Kris Millegan.
Thank you, Bruce, very much. And thank you, folks, for, spending your time here. It's sad that Frank can't be here because today is June 19th. Okay. It's a holiday now. And, we've been doing these roundtables on Wednesdays. And it just so happened that this Wednesday happens to be June 19th. And in looking at these roundtables, I saw that valediction, the story of the Fitzgerald, could be used for a discussion to change the narrative. One of the things that, I've been looking at for starting TrineDay was to create a better world for our children. And one of the things that we do, we don't just do political books, we do mystical books, we do other books on history. And one of the things that I've been looking at for a long time is there's this old story about the 5 races coming to a table to discuss things so that their future would be better and so they could get along. On June 11th, 1963, JFK did his civil rights speech, okay? And I'm going to change one word here big time from Negro to black, okay? Because I grew up in the South, and it was very interesting living in South under Jim Crow, okay? Because as a little white boy, there were no black people in your world, okay? Even when I went to school they had the cooks and the janitors were all white too. Okay, you just didn't see any black people in your world. And as a little kid, I remember going to the local garage, local gas station, and there would be 3 doors there for the restrooms. There would be a men and a women and a colored. And I remember thinking as a youngster, how rude that was. And it's been, Lord have mercy, almost 75 years. And there has been a lot of change, okay? And a lot of that change started with JFK and his speech on June 11th, okay? Because this led to the Civil Rights Act of 64 because he did not get to complete it. Okay, so I'm going to read some from his June 11th speech. And then also, it was very interesting, on June 19th, 1963, JFK released a statement relating to his speech on June 11th. This afternoon, following a series of threats and defiant statements, the presence of Alabama National Guardsmen was required on the University of Alabama to carry out the final and unequivocal order of the United States District Court of the Northern District of Alabama. That order called for the admission of 2 clearly qualified young Alabama residents who happened to have been born black. Today, we are committed to a worldwide struggle to promote and protect the rights of all who wish to be free. And when Americans are sent to Vietnam or West Berlin, we do not ask for whites only. It ought to be possible, therefore, for American students of any color to attend public institutions they select without having to be backed up by troops. It ought to be possible for American consumers of any color to receive equal service in places of public accommodation, such as hotels and restaurants and theaters and retail stores, without being forced to resort to demonstrations in the street. It ought to be possible for American citizens of any color to register to vote in a free election without interference or fear of reprisals. It ought to be possible, in short, for every American to enjoy the privileges of being Americans without regard to his race or his color. In short, every American ought to have the right to be treated as he would wish to be treated, as one would wish his children to be treated. But this is not the case. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities, whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated. If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public schools available, if he cannot vote for the public officials who will represent him, if in short he cannot enjoy the full and free life of which all of us want, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin change and stand in his place? Who among us would then be content with the counsels of patience and delay? 100 years of delay have passed since President Lincoln freed the slaves, yet their heirs, their grandsons, are not fully free. They are not yet freed from the bonds of injustice. They are not freed from the social and economic oppression. And this nation, for all its hopes and boasts, will not be fully free until its citizens are free. We preach freedom around the world, and we mean it. We cherish our freedoms here at home. But are we to say to the world, and much more importantly to each other, that this is a land of free except for the blacks? That we have no second-class citizens except for black folk? That we have no clearer caste system, no ghettos, no master race except with respect to blacks? Now is a time come for this nation to fulfill its promise. We face, therefore, a moral crisis as a country and as a people. It cannot be met by repressive police action. It cannot be left to increase demonstrations in the street. It cannot be quieted by token moves or talk. It is time for the Congress to act. It is not enough to pin the blame on others, to say this is a problem of one section or the country or the other, or to deplore the facts that we face. A great change is at hand, and our task, our obligation, is to make that revolution, that change, peaceful and constructive for all. Those who do nothing are inviting shame as well as violence. Those who act boldly are recognizing right as well as reality. This is one country. It has become one country because all of us and all the people who came here had an equal chance to develop their talents. We cannot say to 10% of the population that you cannot have that right, that your children cannot have the chance to develop whatever their talents that they have, that the only way that they're going to get their rights is to go into the streets and demonstrate. I think that we owe them and we owe ourselves a better country than that. I therefore ask every member of Congress to set aside sectional and political ties and to look at the issue from the viewpoint of the nation. I ask you to look into your hearts, not in search of charity, but for the one plain, proud, and priceless quality that ignites all us Americans, a sense of justice. In this year of the Emancipation Centennial, justice requires us to ensure the blessings of liberty for all Americans and their posterity, not merely for reasons of economic efficiency and world diplomacy and domestic tranquility, but above all, because it is right. Now I'd like to just say a little prayer that I've used many times. Aloha, he ping, om, shalom, salam, emhotep, peace be, omni boni boris, all my relations. Adieu, adios, aloha, amen, and onward to a better future.
Thank you, Kris. And now, investigative journalists, authors, Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould.
We're actually going to continue what we started at the last roundtable when we were bringing back where we are in our own narrative creation process. We kind of gave you an overview at that point, and now we're going to further it. So I'm just going to give you a very abbreviated overview again, and then we're going to continue with the actual process that we're in right now. We left journalism to write screenplays after 7 years of trying to change the mainstream narrative on the real U.S. role in the December 27, 1979 Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. But 27 years later, Hollywood's purpose was revealed as the creator of the official narrative on Afghanistan that was left for posterity. A mostly propaganda book titled Charlie Wilson's War became the final word on the U.S. role that far too many Americans continue to believe is fact. In 2020, we found a new level of rewriting that history when we faced a challenge from academics to further corrupt the U.S.-Afghan narrative. Given our 40 years of research, it was easy to debunk this fabricated thesis. But as we had discovered in 1987, our efforts at affecting the historical record does not change the media's mesmerizing power over the public's mind by reinventing reality to suit their ideological purposes. A recent attempt to alter JFK's narrative was the most stunning discovery of all. Titled JFKX Solving the Crime of the Century, it is a documentary that claims the Zapruder film is a hoax. Rather than having been assassinated, JFK faked his own death and lived out his days on Aristotle Onassis's Greek island. Needless to say, these claims are the hoax. But the research we did into the Fitzgerald legacy going back 1,000 years is what is a more powerful motivation for the assassination, and it is rooted in that deep history. In fact, JFK was destined to be sacrificed even before he became president based on his lineage alone. The history we did into the Fitzgerald legacy going back 1,000, the history we unearthed still has a long way to go to penetrate the obsessive focus the mainstream has on 20th century events. Since JFK still resonates so deeply with people from all over the world, it still motivates media, academic, and political elites to attack his reputation. But the good news is that when we turned our attention from corrupted mainstream fantasy to our personal narrative, we found the real power. It came alive almost instantly in 2020 as we began to write our memoir entwined with the deep history of the Fitzgerald family. It is being delivered through the Valediction series, Book 1, 3 Nights of Desmond, Book 2, Resurrection, and Revelation, the finale that is being written now. And now Paul will give you a preview of our process, and we'll continue to periodically deliver updates at future roundtables.
When we moved from journalism to writing screenplays in 1987, we learned that you must first create a narrative by writing a treatment of the story you're intending to tell. In the case of a movie, the treatment had to reflect what you're going to see in the screenplay from scene to scene in roughly 120 pages without interruption, with each page representing a minute of screen time. Sounds easy, right? It's completely visual and requires as much action and as few words as possible. Given that criteria, I always wondered what my experience in Afghanistan would look like as a movie. I couldn't imagine it. The experience was largely intellectual, and a lot of what happened was a result of some startling coincidences. Except for actually being in Afghanistan, most of the action was research and conversation. It didn't fit any of the paradigms of film I'd ever expected to see on the screen. By the time we'd got around to writing screenplays, there was a film professional named Sid Field who'd begun to break down what made a movie successful and developed a formula that would help you make your screenplay worth watching. Over time, we came to see that this formula not only helped in writing a better screenplay, but also a better book, because it focused on creating a consistent and continuous narrative, and the narrative creation process is at the root of everything we do and say. Breaking down narratives this way also made us realize that America's narrative had been altered in subtle ways on many occasions, and probably without most people even realizing it. One of the not-so-subtle shifts occurred in 1980, when two pro-war intellectuals from the Hudson Institute, Colin Gray and Keith Payne, published a proposition in Foreign Policy magazine called Victory is Possible to justify the use of nuclear weapons against the Soviet Union. In the shadow of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the heated 1980 presidential election, two radical hawks proposing to nuke the Soviet Union really wasn't that unusual. But in this case, they based their argument on the medieval doctrine of the Catholic Church, known as the just war doctrine. And that was unusual. Gray and Payne argued that rather than being an irrational end of history, fighting a nuclear war was rational. And to take it one step further, they went on to argue that in the face of a Soviet victory, fighting a nuclear war was the moral thing to do, and not fighting it was immoral. If we needed further motivation to get to Afghanistan and change the narrative on the Soviet occupation in the minds of the American public, Gray and Payne provided it. But it wasn't until the 1990s that I learned the doctrine had been applied by the Pope in the 1580s to justify the Fitzgerald family's holy war against the Elizabethans. And it was then I realized the narrative I'd been compelled by coincidence to be involved in was ongoing and preceded me by at least 400 years. Finding out that my own personal narrative was part of a larger one, and a spiritual one at that, came as a shock. And as we worked to expand the story and discovered connections to JFK and his assassination, it became clear that we were not just writing a screenplay, we were rewriting history. So, what does that history sound like, and how do we get people to understand that the narrative creation process is ongoing and that we are all, whether we know it or not, part of it? Thanks to Kris, we got to speak at the 60th anniversary conference of the JFK assassination in Dallas back in November. After publishing the first book of the valediction in 2020, Kris recognized the importance of the Fitzgerald legacy to the JFK assassination and wanted us to explore it further through the monthly roundtable discussions which he hosts. But when Kris got us the invitation to speak in Dallas, it completed a circle that began when we first dug into the 1,000-year Fitzgerald family history in 1991. We'd been to Texas before for CNN in the 1980s and driven in from Dallas-Fort Worth, brought back the memories of the big, gray, unforgiving piece of scrubland called Texas that had provided the platform for the JFK assassination. We knew back then, for a number of reasons, that the place had an unusual personality, which had formed a part of my own narrative as a boy growing up. My father's sister had married a Texaco's chief oil explorer just after World War II, and my father's best friend and army buddy was a famous horse doctor for the King Ranch and veterinarian for the Ringling Brothers Circus. But we'd also learned in our work for CNN that there was another story that brought the importance of Texas into perspective. A story that combined the power and influence of Rome, together with the New York financial world, the Democratic Party deep state, and a billion-dollar Texas foundation crawling with influential high society of big oil and elite white Russian emigres, of which one George de Mohrenschildt was a part. Texas influenced the world in ways only a few understood. And after visiting Dallas, we realized the convention provided us with the perfect platform from which to gather all the pieces of our narrative into perspective, as well as to launch the valediction revelation. The revelation begins in Dealey Plaza in the fall of 2023 with Liz and Paul, the characters, standing before the Masonic shrine dedicated to Isis and Osiris, observing the school book depository, the yellow X painted on the street in front of it, the grassy knoll, and then the triple overpass down the road. The screen flashes back momentarily to November 22nd, 1963, and then back to Book Depository, where they discuss how impossible it would have been to kill the president from that angle. Paul speaks about how close everything is, how the distance from the grassy knoll and to the X mark where Kennedy was shot isn't very far. How easy it would have been to triangulate the shooting in such a confined area to make sure there was no way JFK was getting out of there alive. It's almost suffocating, Paul says, secret, claustrophobic, and poisonously corrupt. Liz nods in agreement and comments that it's like a Shakespearean stage. Paul responds, Elizabethan. I had no idea that Elm Street was an exit ramp on the way to the triple overpass. Liz asks if that was some kind of sick joke. Paul says no. Ridicule is part of the ritual process for revenge. Liz responds, even in death? To which Paul replies, especially in death. Dermot McMurrough, the King of Leinster, bit off the noses of the dead tribal chieftains that had dethroned him when they were laid out before him by the Norman conquerors after the battle for Dublin in 1170. Liz cringed and asked, "Why would he do that?" To which Paul replies, "Because they'd killed his son and buried him with a dog. They never expected the Fitzgeralds would come from Wales to help him reclaim his kingdom and give him revenge." Liz is surprised. "So that explains your sense of irony." Paul remarks, "No, that explains the ritual. The whole assassination was a Masonic ritual of the sacred king. November 22nd was the anniversary of the dissolution of the Knights Templar. The motorcade turned north onto Stemmons Freeway after the shooting. North is the direction of the Tree of Life in the ancient Manichaean ritual. The event is populated with three shots, one in the neck, one in the back, and one in the head. 3 tramps arrested whose names are never revealed. The triple overpass forms a trident by the Trinity River. It's all right there." Paul then devolves into a narrative with Dealey Plaza as the background. Narration. It had somehow come around to where it all began in 1992 after seeing Oliver Stone's JFK film. Only this time it wasn't the filmmaker that pushed it ahead. It was our publisher, Kris Millegan, when he got us invited to address the anniversary convention of the JFK assassination in Dallas. It had been 60 years, and we'd figured out the narrative, how it got created and how far back it went. And standing in Dealey Plaza, a Neoplatonic shrine to Isis and Osiris had just confirmed it. The place had acted as a sacrificial altar. The Kennedy assassination was part myth, part ritual, and part sorcery, and only a handful of people understood the real secret. Despite a flood of information regarding the JFK assassination that had poured out over 60 years, the official narrative still circled around the lone gunman and his magic bullet, and the counter-narratives went round and round in circles. Someone had to break the vicious cycle that had come to possess the Kennedy assassination narrative, and we decided to break it once and for all times by delivering it in a hotel ballroom in Dallas, Texas in November 2023. Narration. We had come a long way towards grasping the big picture behind the assassination since our first meeting with Oliver Stone in 1992. We now called it the case of JFK and the Fitzgeralds, and it filled a lot of holes in the assassination narrative that most people had never even heard of. Black and white images of Allen Dulles, Bay of Pigs, Meyer Lansky, and Lucky Luciano filled the screen. The narrative resumes. Over the years, I'd come to see that there were any number of people with the motive and capability of doing what happened on November 22nd, 1963. The CIA, anti-Castro Cubans, organized crime. My own bookshelf contained a dozen deeply researched books about the subject. Seen from that moment in time, their logic all worked perfectly, but for me, there was always something missing. So by going to Dallas, I wanted to present a connection to an older and deeper background story about JFK that put his assassination into a broader historical context, in the hope that the audience would find worthy of serious consideration. Interior, University of New Hampshire Gymnasium, 1980. The first hint that I was being drawn directly into the JFK saga came in early 1980, when we were invited to hear Ted Kennedy's challenge to President Carter's nomination for a second term. As soon as we arrived, one of the organizers came over to introduce a Kennedy insider named Al Lowenstein. Lowenstein had been the driving force behind Robert Kennedy's campaign in 1968. He'd carried on after RFK's death and spent most of the 1970s researching both murders. Just being a Fitzgerald was enough for Lowenstein to make me a confidant, and he made his intentions clear when he told us in a hushed tone, "We're going to have to get Ted elected and finally bring those CIA sons of bitches that killed Jack and Bobby to justice. Since your family, I can tell you this. We know who did it, and people are willing to talk, but we need the presidency to protect them." As Liz and I drove home through the dark New Hampshire forest, we talked about what had happened. I thought that was the end of it, until 2 weeks later, we read that Al Lowenstein had been murdered by a colleague who'd walked into his office, shot him 7 times, then put the gun down and waited for the police. Lowenstein's murder made me wonder whether we hadn't known something was brewing and was passing on the mission before it got too late. And so began a journey that took us from Boston to Kabul and back 1,000 years to London, Jerusalem, and the Holy Grail, to Scottish Rite Freemasonry and the death of JFK. Title of the film is The Valediction Revelation. It will conclude images of Fidel Castro entering Havana, JFK with General Curtis LeMay watching the war games, U.S. tanks confronting Soviet tanks at a checkpoint Charlie in East Berlin, JFK meeting with Nikita Khrushchev. Narration. Everybody knows JFK was shaking up the deep state, but it turns out there was a tradition behind his behavior. Images of Boston, Mass. Circa 1900. Horse-drawn trolleys fill the streets as workers come and go from their shops and factories. Narration. JFK's maternal grandfather, John Francis Fitzgerald, had made him aware of his family's roots going back to the foundation of the British Empire, most likely informed him that old grudges died hard. JFK slams his fist on the desk. Narration. JFK's declaration that he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds had been on everyone's short list of motives from the beginning. But few realized what that phrase would have meant to the people he was threatening to splinter, considering that they saw themselves as modern-day Knights Templar who'd been splintered and cast to the four winds themselves by the Pope in 1312. It might be hard to believe that America's elite Cold Warriors, spies of the 1940s and 50s, considered themselves to be holy warriors modeled on a once wealthy and powerful medieval knighthood that had been crushed and demonized by a Catholic Pope. But if you looked at it through the filter of a bitter black and white Manichaean struggle for power that had seesawed back and forth between Rome and London through the centuries, you might get a better idea of how the CIA viewed their mission. I think that's about as far as I'm going to go with this today.
That's a cliffhanger. Hope.
It's a cliffhanger, right. So what we want to do is, just to summarize, we want to bring the history of what we're going to present as a film. We want to bring a brief family history of how the Fitzgeralds got to Boston, what it meant to them, and then go back in time and use the platform in Dallas to jump back and forth in terms of the history and the meaning of what that means today.
We are looking at this as this is a work in progress. This is an ongoing process. This is your opportunity to, let us know what you think is going on, because part of our hope is that through that, we are going to be able to actually deliver a much better treatment, film, script, whatever it turns out to be. Because the ability to get the perspective of the receiver is really important. And we have already had that experience. In fact, when we were creating our speech for the presentation in Dallas, we so appreciated the roundtable we had the opportunity to present it and then to get the feedback. You cannot imagine how much that helped us. So we're coming to you again for that.
Yeah.
Well, taking the story and making it relevant, most people are just simply, not aware of what happened, to JFK in 1963, or the political situation that was created by the Cold War during that period of time. And certainly the mainstream media has been no help in terms of creating a narrative that would help Americans understand what we need to do to make this country work better for everybody.
To raise the speech that JFK delivered in 1963 to a level of understanding how important it is to literally bring it to life.
I have a real simple question to Paul as a Fitzgerald and to Paul and Liz in creating a new, nuanced, more comprehensive narrative as a way forward. Are you at all concerned that as a Fitzgerald, you might lean towards the Fitzgerald side of the Manichaean power struggle? You mentioned London and Rome and your perspectives on the power struggle. As a Fitzgerald, might you not lean a little bit towards the Fitzgerald narrative?
When we were doing our book tour for Invisible History, Afghanistan's Untold Story, we went to a number of different places, and we had the wonderful opportunity to go down to Florida, and we were hosted by a group down there. And I got to sit next to a general, retired general, U.S. Army general, who had he'd driven a tank in Patton's army during World War II across France. And he was now in his 80s, and he was, I said, I told him about my father having been drafted and arrived in in France just in time for the Battle of the Bulge, and so they had something in common. And he got all excited about that. He thought that was terrific. And but I explained. He said, "What's going to happen to the world?" He said, I really can't understand the fabric of what's going on right now." And this was in 2009. Things were obvious to him that the world we were living in was changing very rapidly. And I just said to him that I feel as if the structures that we grew up with, all of the structures, whether the governments or whether the churches or whether the family structures, whatever, were going to just simply not be relevant any longer. It's not that they have to be destroyed or gotten rid of in some kind of revolutionary action, that we have accumulated enough ideas about the way we want to live and the way we should be living, that the kind of things would be like growing into adolescence and then out of adolescence into adulthood, and be suddenly becoming responsible adults for the planet and for the rest of the population. And you put things aside when you take on that mantle, when you put the toys away and you start dealing with the problems that are actually there, things start to happen. And I was confident that could be done. And he was pleased. He was, as a veteran of World War II, and he'd seen it. I said, "What was it like?" And he said, "It was the most amazing thing." He said, "Nothing in life has ever been quite the same as sitting in the turret of a tank, driving through France in the snow behind Patton." He said it was just absolutely unbelievable. Because my father had been there, I heard the stories from him about what it was like, and he didn't talk a lot about it. I don't think any of the veterans of the war actually really dug into the whole nature of what it was. And it's something that I think we really have to realize. It impacted. I have two older brothers and an older sister, 12 and 15 years older. Then they lived through it with my father gone for 2 years. And my brother came to visit me last fall on his way down to Florida. And he said, "Dad was a great guy." He said, "But I think I got overworked when he was gone." And here it was. My sister died 2 years ago. I know she was overworked because of the feeling, she used to take 3 buses to go to his drugstore in Cambridge to help him, make the thing work. And so we all kind of pitched in, and I was late to that. I didn't come until 1951. So, I missed all of that struggle that went on inside and that still is still sounding out in my own siblings and my 88-year-old brother.
Paul, if I could interject, Alana, did that address your question?
I don't think that Paul directly answered my question.
How could he do a better job?
He could do a better job, Paul, by saying, do you think the fact that you're a Fitzgerald will have you slant or lean towards the Fitzgerald side of this hundreds year old narrative in terms of the Manichaean power struggle of Rome and the Vatican?
To look at it more objectively?
Yeah. Can you look at it objectively?
The fact is that I've come to this opinion because I am a Fitzgerald and because I have studied the subject and I have studied the history. So, I mean, in that sense, I can't disavow who I am or my contribution to that in any sense. Okay.
No, not asking you to. Just
I really
asking
don't.
you
My
to.
whole point, Alana, is that I have nothing to personally gain from the Fitzgeralds gaining anything. And the fact is that whatever sides were drawn up in the 12th or 13th or 15th or 17th or 18th century, and even with JFK in the 20th century, what I'm trying to say is, and our work has revealed, is the fact that old grudges die hard. The fact is that those grudges don't impact on me. Okay, I have been told, Alana, when I was one of the producers of Hair, when I was in Hair, and I was 19 years old, and one of the producers told me, he said, the Fitzgeralds were never accepted in Boston society. This is a money guy, a DuPont, told me this, right? So I said, all I know is that my father works 6.5 days a week to make his drugstore work. to serve his community in Cambridge. He's never complained about the changing structure of that neighborhood, which was changed greatly from 1947 until when he finally had to give up the store in 1965 because you couldn't make a living there any longer.
Paul, could I ask Alana where she might be coming from with the inspiration of that question, and then allow others to.
I was just curious because it's so likely to lean towards your own family's narrative, but it's not. I think Paul, I get where he's coming from. Paul and Liz are people of great integrity and goodwill. They've looked very, very deeply at history and current geopolitics, so I respect them. So I don't need to go on with this. And at some point before we're finished, in terms of what Kris said in the beginning about the Civil War and civil rights, I'm kind of in the heart of Civil War territory near Gettysburg, and my town was burned to the ground in the Civil War. And I have a perspective on that and the Earth rights vision, the Earth rights democracy, the land problem that I could share to fit in that. And the other one, when Paul mentioned just war doctrine, man, I think that's so important because it's come through now as the responsibility to protect. That's the reason why we went into Libya and all these other things. We're there, guardians of democracy and all things good, true, and free. And that is the continuation of St. Augustine's just war theory, which was presented as a way to get the pacifist Christians, when they kept killing them in the Colosseum. And then Rome finally said, well, we're going to Christianize and we're going to define what Christianity means so that we can tame these wild heathen pacifists. And we're going to find a way to get them to go into the Roman wars for just cause. And this is 300s, Constantine Emperor. And the just war theory is really carrying through today. And it's really important, I think, to look at. So Paul brought that up as well.
Thank you. I want to hear Liz's comment on it, and then I got a quick question for Paul. Liz, please.
I having been the one who's been engaged in this conversation with Paul, for a rather long time, I can guarantee, Alana, that Paul holds no special attitude towards his family. He states what needs to be stated, no matter who it is. I can guarantee you that. But I would like to tell a very quick story to really make the point about what we feel is important. Okay, when Paul brought up the just war doctrine that was actually activated for the Fitzgerald family's war against the Elizabethans, which was a genocide. When we hear that word today, it was a genocide, a 30-year genocide. Okay, well, the fact is that Paul came to the realization that it didn't matter that it was a just war. In fact, fighting a just war doesn't matter. It's about the function of war. It's about what it actually does. And that was part of the revelation that he had. And that is actually the conclusion in The Voice, which was the first book we wrote about the Fitzgerald legacy and the dream relation, the mystical experiences that we were having, and putting it together with the Afghanistan experience. And that is, in fact, the fulfillment of that story, is that revelation.
Thank you, Liz. I see Ed Dodson's hand, and then Mary Carlin. If I've ignored your attempts to speak, I'll check with you after. Ed Dodson, how are you, Ed?
I'm doing fine. My observation about creating the narrative is my own long work of writing history has taught me that history is extremely messy, and trying to identify causes and effects and triggers brings me to the work of the British science historian that you might remember from the 1980s, who did the series Connections and The Day the Universe Changed, James Burke. His narrative is a narrative that works very well in identifying how all of this fits together. He doesn't cover everything, but he leads us in a direction that says there are always going to be powerful interests motivated to secure their own advancement at the expense of others. Yeah. And it's the others who are constantly striving to try to counter that effect. And we've had the fortunate innovation of social democracy to mitigate but not solve the problems. It's the same thing with the land question that Alana and I and Wendell have worked on for so many decades. We we've been successful in finding ways to mitigate the impact, but not enact solutions. And I think the political issue is just one of those that we're still struggling with. How do we, in effect, create an environment where democracy can thrive, where the commons can be protected, and where individual citizens have a potential impact on the decisions that are made in the interest of the larger community? And I have my own thoughts about that. I have my own instinctive appreciation for conspiracy. All one has to do is read about Cecil Rhodes and, the roundtables that he organized on behalf of the Anglo-American empire that he wanted to see dominate the world. And that leads right into the Dulles brothers and the CIA. And if you want to read the dirty details about that, there's no better book in my view, but Jonathan Whitney's book, Endless Enemies.
Excellent.
Thank you. Mary, is that true you wanted to speak, or am I misinterpreting?
So I was thrilled to be able to join this, and it just reinforces how much I don't know. And I just feel we're just lied to regularly and just obscure the truth. My work has been with the Earth Society Foundation and John McConnell and the original Earth Day on the spring equinox. And, this idea with Margaret Mead was like, we're going to have a holiday, but we're going to focus on the Earth. I'm at a point now where Earth Day is every day, and there's changing times right now, and we have to be involved. And whether I just watched a special with the Dalai Lama about world peace through inner peace. But I just feel the problem is so vast when you just look at what we're subjected to. The next thing from, the Supreme Court, stop. We need more joy and laughter. And if I could just leave you with a quick quote from George Carlin, I claim relationship, but I watched his revised 10 Commandments. And he said, you know what, we can reduce some of these, and it came up with, thou shalt always be honest and faithful, especially to the provider of your nookie. And then he added, thou shalt keep thy religion to thyself. Okay, that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Glad you could make it here. Dean's comment in the chat, or Dean, unless you want to share with us.
My comment really has to do with the fact that it's the control of the narrative that keeps people constantly distracted and I think disabled from being able to understand the scope of all of what we're talking about here and what's necessary to change it. So I like Mary talking about the inner work that has to be done for any of this to be meaningful. So I guess the thought we had, Ruth and I were driving up to the Bay Area, and we were talking about the reality of exploitation that goes on. It's just taken for granted. So much of the narrative basically endorses the idea and doesn't take a look at the fact that look at the consolidation of power that has gone on in our lifetimes. Where media is basically owned by 6 companies. There's a few people who sit around and basically plot the course of what's going to be done, what war's next, what distractions coming. So I feel like to have a 1,000-year scope of this, like Paul and Liz are doing in their work, is really crucial.
Mm-hmm.
It's really crucial to understand where this is coming from and how much the challenge is in front of us to make anything different. So,
Dean, I want to tell you and also others who are in agreement with you that Paul and Liz just gave a great interview with me on my own personal podcast, and I steer you to it because if this is new or people want more meat on the bones of the things you just described, Dean, go to Rumble on my channel, Reality with Bruce DeTorres. Marty Lewis.
Yeah, I just want to say about Paul and Liz, I believe that we're all one, but we have to learn how to know who we are. Like what Mary was saying, we have to have inner peace in ourselves, but we have to know who we are. And I don't know anybody who's researched as much as Paul and Liz have. It's amazing, really. And, the truth is coming. I like that your book's going to come out with victory here in a minute, because there is only one truth in the end. And we're getting so close.
We are, and that's what I wanted to emphasize in a nutshell. What I think about these competing forces, is it going to be this guy's going to win, or that guy's going to win, or that woman's going to win, and that woman's going to win? That is my discussion kind of revealed to myself with this retired army general, was the fact that I realized that the structures were just going to fall away, and they were not going to be important any longer. And that we were going to be faced with, as human beings and occupants of this planet and this country, with having to make up our own minds in terms of what kind of place this was, what kind of world we were living in. And we weren't going to really have much choice about it, because those old structures were going to die. They were just going to simply deconstruct. But we were still going to be here, and our spirit was going to be here. And I think that I have, the overwhelming belief in humanity that that we can achieve something that we haven't even conceived of yet.
Amen.
In terms of what this planet is all about.
Amen.
I'd like to quickly add that one of the things that we are convinced is critical is the end of the revenge and retribution cycle. And that is part of what the whole cycle that JFK got caught in, that the justification for these kinds of killings, whether they are a sacred sacrifice or whether it's the Hatfields and the McCoys, okay, there is a level of revenge and retribution that is so invested in people that there is a continuing sense of justification. Well, most of us don't have that problem, and we have to be able to separate from the ones who really still have that problem from those of us who say, I'm ready to give that up. I have no problem at all. I have no issue with anybody, okay, that I feel I'm going to have to maintain that in order to feel I can go into a future.
Could it be as simple as asking more and more people, what do you want? Because it's a leading question to me. More people will be able to divorce themselves from those who are all caught up in revenge and retribution, I believe, if they could be challenged with the question, what do you want? Because if they could admit, I want to be happy.
Yeah.
I want to feel peace. I want as much stress-free hours in life as I possibly can, especially with this addition. Do we only have what we want and intend for others? And that could open up a huge metaphysical aha, because we are all one, like Marty was saying. And what if we could all agree that the one that we are is here? Whatever here is, that's what we are. We're all here. And we all have to win. Paul was talking about my guy or your guy in the election. It doesn't work unless we all win, and we all want all of us to win. Everybody chew on that while I say, Wendell, hi, what's on your mind?
What I think is going on for individuals is their own psychology, their own psyche. And Paul referred to the idea of us as humanity growing up and becoming responsible. It turns out that as individuals, our experiences from childhood, very early childhood to after 7 years old, we were told to shut up, stop being a kid, so that a lot of stuff that has gone on in our own psyches and the traumas that we've had took place long before we had any way to articulate that, to get to have any distance from it. So all of that stuff, whenever it happened, if it wasn't resolved at the time, lodged itself in our subconscious. So that all the way well into adulthood, it runs the show if it hasn't been noticed and understood and resolved and integrated. And here I am at 81, just finally getting, why are you so reactive in certain cases? The reactivity stuff comes right out of I don't know where the hell it came from, except that now I'm looking at it. And there's a study that I'm doing with that and a practice involved with that one of the few great joys of my life has been to notice, Wendell, you are being so reactive and so judgmental, and you don't have to do that.
Yeah.
And this goes along with the idea of what you resist persists.
Yeah.
And if I catch myself resisting, I don't have to do that.
Right.
That the whole point of all of this reactivity was a desperate cry for love.
Well, it brings us back to the main issue that Henry George identified for us as to what constitutes a just society. And a just society cannot exist when there is private property in nature. That is his conclusion, and it is what we're left with. It's why I mentioned earlier that the best we've been able to do is mitigate the problems by virtue of social democracy. So if I think of JFK, for example, and his insights, his main failed insight was in economics and in property rights. JFK is very influenced by the Keynesian ideas and by the economists who ostensibly were Keynesian, but that Keynes would have denied they were. We could never get beyond that in the discussion. And so that's leaving us here in 2024 with getting back to mitigation rather than solution. And so when Wendell talks about love, love is great, but love will not bring us justice. What will bring us justice is law, and law that respects property in individuals, property in what we produce, but turns property in nature to the commons. And until we get there, we're going to struggle.
Yeah, and anyone watching who's new to the roundtables, the video playbacks are on YouTube at the channel Valediction Vision. And I'm going to save 5 minutes later for Alana Hartsock to talk about her book, The Earth Belongs to Everyone, because Ed may have just said a concept brand new to people that just blew your mind. Like, what do you mean no private property in nature? And the title, what did Bruce just say? The Earth Belongs to Everyone. Allow me to swing it to Kris Millegan, please.
I'm going to talk a little bit about dynamics. History tends to run in cycles, okay? And as Ed mentioned, history is very messy, okay? And there have been, several attempts by people to, quote unquote, rule the world. Why I started TrineDay, okay, it's because my daddy told me some stuff I didn't understand. I researched that out and started looking at secret societies and came across a group called Skull and Bones. And I wrote about Skull and Bones and send out missives to publishers, and nobody would print it. TrineDay basically is to tell the narrative that I was starting to understand about how these secret societies, quote unquote, control the world, because that's what it's about. It's about control. Okay. And again, it's a Leviathan of 3 levels, and each level has 3 parts. The top level is mining metal and money, because, if you control the mining, that the money's based on, you're in a good position. Okay. And then you have this very active middle layer, drugs, guns, and oil. Okay. Where they use war and urban renewal and things like that. And then where this meets the road, okay, is media, and then movies/music, because they got to control the culture, it'll bite them. And then quote unquote magic, their ability to hoodwink us, to make us think something else is happening, and their preponderance on using mass trauma rituals to keep us in line. Okay, and some of these rituals come from this revenge and retribution cycle that the Fitzgeralds were talking about. And one of the books that we publish is called Bridge of the Gods, and it was actually the first novel written in Oregon, and it was written by a guy who spent a lot of time at Cielo Falls, where the Indians had been, congregating there for thousands of years. Did a lot of gambling and different things, and he took some of their stories and then wrote this nice little book. And the basic crux of the book is this preacher comes from Boston, comes all the way out to the West, and his big story is he wants to stop the blood feuds. Okay, because one Indian tribe, they kill somebody. Oh well, we got to go kill you. Okay, and it kind of reminds me of something, our parents would try and tell us. They would say, well, be the bigger person. Okay. Because, and that's how, that's how you stop the revenge and retribution cycle is you say no, and you don't participate in it. Okay. And then also, Wendell was talking about reacting, and that's, it's good to understand when you're reacting, because when you're reacting, you aren't in charge. Somebody else is. Okay. So you need to, start acting on, your own positions. I'm really quite hopeful because it's a long march of history. This is June 19th. And so, I was trying to talk, a bit about Black folk, because a lot of our problems here in the United States, okay, had to do with the question of slavery, of people believing that, I own you. Okay, now maybe this, rose out of, as civilization grew, and, who knows how it happened. Okay, but when you really think about it, it's not proper action to own other people. Okay, and so dynamics, what's going on here? Okay, basically, the internet is changing the world. Okay, because by allowing this to happen, allowing people all over the place being able to just talk and discuss and do things, and then just the knowledge, the understanding. Like when I started TrineDay, I would get calls from intelligence people and military people. They figured out what they were doing 20 years, 30 years ago. Okay, now I'm getting calls from people that are currently in the military, currently in intel, because the powers that be aren't able to hoodwink them enough to get them to go do their bad things. Okay, and so we have the chance here, okay, to really perfect the union and continue on a journey and create a better world here for our children.
I want to first address what Wendell said. I think about very important. From what I just recently saw something that made this very clear. From the time you are 3 months in, before you're born until 7 years old, you are being downloaded. You are being programmed. You are like an open channel. Every single human being goes through this process. Nobody is excluded. It's like you're born with no program at some level coming directly from your own family, from your mother, from your father, from your siblings, from whoever is taking care of you. So Wendell, you're totally right but it is always unconscious to a level. There's no way to really know. But once you're onto it, and I think that's the secret, just assume it's there. It's about behavior that you say, wait a minute, where does that come from? Many times you look at your family and you can see somebody just told me, you act just like your mother. You're crazy. That's when you're finding out, somebody else can see it in you. Okay, I think that's really important. And I also feel what Ed focused on about JFK. I wouldn't be surprised, Ed, if by the time JFK got through Harvard, the name, the Georgist economics didn't exist for him. What existed for his grandfather was no longer probably even being offered, that he would in fact be kept from it. And remember that he was not an economist per se. So I would imagine that is the kind of thing that, the powers of the neoliberals was to make sure that those ideas really didn't get easily into, the upper echelons of economic planning.
The being in a super learning state till we're 7 years old is well discussed by the work of Dr. Bruce Lipton, best-selling book, The Biology of Belief, which is so insightful for every human who's trying to figure themselves out. And I believe that's all of us. Dean, you wrote, who's the author of Bridge of the Gods? Kris, does that come to mind? Or
Frederick Homer Balch, Balch.
Thank you. Dean also searched that on TrineDay.com. Kris, I just want to commend your reading of JFK's speech, because I have watched him deliver that countless times. I've read it countless times. But hearing somebody else, you read it out loud, brought out so much. So it's just in praise of the practice of reading out loud, which really used to develop our minds before electricity and radio and movies and television and the internet and now cell phones crushed our blossoming development. If families would just pass a book around and have everybody read a chapter out loud, you'd be surprised at the brilliance that gets cultivated just by that practice. Paul, I really heard all the threes that you mentioned around the assassination and at Dealey Plaza, and a latest three that's really being brought forth in the research is by Dr. David Mantik, who for years has been teaching this, but now he's got a definitive book about it called The Final Analysis of the Shots That Hit Kennedy, 3 bullets in the head. So add that to your threes, cutting edge, leading edge, most impressive research about the assassination. Anybody listening who thought, what the heck's Paul talking about? A Masonic area at Dealey Plaza, monuments to Osiris and Isis. I'll simply mention the obelisk, just like the Washington Monument, but a smaller version of it in Dealey Plaza, just like at Washington, D.C., has ponds of water surrounding it. Washington just has the one thing, and those are the Egyptian symbology, 2 examples that are embedded in Western Europe and into the United States, which is a door into what the heck is so fascinating about Egyptian symbology to all these institutions of power. That is a huge rabbit hole to go down, but that's just part of substantiating what Paul was saying there. Who's got the next comment or question?
This obelisk, I mean, obviously hierarchical power. There's the point at the top, there's a control system at the top, and that's what we're trying to break from. We're breaking from power over to power with. That the full blossoming of the individual power of creativity and wonderful uniqueness. This is how those of us who are Georgists relate to the tax issue. Don't tax the creativity, the individual initiative, our individual labor, our individual contribution. Free us from the burden of that taxation. But in order to express our creativity, our individuality, our uniqueness, and have time to appreciate life and to self-reflect and to heal, we have to have a fair economy. To have a fair economy, we have to look at the very basics, that the earth is a gift of whatever creator we might want to believe in. We know humans didn't make the earth, and we know through thousands of years that fair societies have been found, that have been in balance, that have been coherent, that have been creative. They have always found a mechanism to share the earth. And to go back to tax policy, Vedic economics thousands of years ago, land value tax in the Indus River Valley. Wow. They never thought that this particular policy went back eons of time. Indus River Valley, one of the high points of civilization. You can trace it through thousands of years, whether we honor the land as a gift for us all to share, or whether we lose that thread of the perennial wisdom teaching. So Bruce, for some reason, mentioned my book. I'm just going to say, if you want a free PDF, go to THEIU.org, go into resources, go into books. You'll get the free PDF of the 30 articles and essays that I had written over the years. Touching base again on the civil rights and the issue, I mentioned I'm from the area. It's a very Civil War area. I'm 18 miles west of Gettysburg, just over the most eastern ridge of the Appalachian Mountains. I was born and raised and then came back to Chambersburg, the only town north of the Mason-Dixon that was burned to the ground during the Civil War. And it was also the area where Thaddeus Stevens was the congressional representative. If you all watched the movie Lincoln, Thaddeus Stevens played a key role. He was the most audacious, boldest, bravest, outspoken person for abolition of slavery. And it continued to, post-Civil War, the whole question was land reform for the South. What are we going to do with these millions of acres of the plantations? And he was a leader of, and others, the 40 acres and a mule, the land reform for the South, 40 acres, small farms for all the freed people and all the poor whites, with enough left over to sell to pay off the debt from the Civil War. Why did that not happen? We're back to the pyramid, the obelisk, the concentration of power in the hands of few. And I actually came across this information from a history book at the library of the great Masonic halls in Philadelphia. So what it said, the conversation was the Northern industrialists didn't want land reform for the South because they were concerned that the Northern industrial worker in their factories, their wage slaves, might get the idea that they too should have access to land. And if that were to happen, they would lose their wage slaves. It was the Northern industrial factory owners that put the kibosh ultimately on 40 acres and a mule, which would have been the Jeffersonian land rights democracy, which had a totally different narrative and outcome post-Civil War than the Black people having to then become serfs essentially when they were working and having to pay 50% of their crops to the landowner, and then fleeing north to the industrial factories, and the factories closed. So what is it? Philadelphia, Baltimore, Chicago, Detroit, we see people of color trapped in terrible impoverishment where they are being exploited by landlords who are taking their rents out of the area and further aggrandizing the few over the many. I call it internal colonialism.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's a little mini lecture within all these great lectures that we've heard. But I just want us all to kind of get on to the big picture of the earth rights and the land problem, and even more so to actually do something about it.
This land value taxation, if there were an idea that could pop out of a jack in the box to really substantially improve instantly, miraculously, magically, so much of our problems, it's that. And it can be studied at viu.org, where you can get Alana's book and learn about it from her book, The Earth Belongs to Everyone. And that's why Kris and Paul and Liz and Alana and myself have too much to say. No, we're just enthused about the opportunity to talk about all this in only 90 minutes. We've got 7 minutes. I see a hand. Wendell Fitzgerald, hi.
Two things. We are not talking about taxing land. We are talking about taxing land value. Land value is a creation of human beings. Land is not. It is a free gift of nature. Land value we create with our numbers and our need for access to land. If you're not sharing the earth by taxing its value, that's truly important. But the corollary to that is untaxing our earned incomes from our labor, our wages, and from the use of unmonopolized capital, which are tools of production. All of the tools, all the buildings, all of the factory, all of that. And it's kind of interesting that in the days of slavery, slaves were considered capital, and they were. If that was the narrative, it was okay to own them, and they were very expensive and very productive. Unfortunately, that created a completely unearned income, the same kind of income that comes from ownership of land. It's an unearned income. It's an enormous exploitation. So tax land values, socialize that, have that be the source of our revenue, the revenue for community, but at the same time, untax what we do, our buildings and our wages and all of that. Not being able to own a slave or own land makes them, it triggers their first chakra safety problems. Little compassion goes a long way.
Thank you. I want to read what Kris dropped in the chat and then invite Paul and Liz for final thoughts, and then invite Kris for final thoughts. The earth is our mother. Care for her. Honor all your relations. Open your heart and soul to the Great Spirit. All life is sacred. Treat all beings with respect. Take from the earth what is needed and nothing more. Do what needs to be done for the good of all. Give constant thanks to the Great Spirit for each day. Speak the truth, but only for the good in others. Follow the rhythms of nature. Enjoy life's journey, but leave no tracks. Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould.
I solved all my problems by accepting the fact that I was an elitist and a snob. And I did that when I was about 12 years old. So the fact is that Wendell, this Fitzgerald thing is something you got to learn to live with, and you have certainly done that. And I'm learning in the process, and I just want Alana to appreciate the fact that we're all elitists and snobs on the way to recovery, and and we're doing our best to try to be as human and as helpful as possible. So please bear with us. We're getting there.
Wait, I do have something to quickly say. If you want to have an idea of this kind of attitude, listen to the song Semois on Camelot, and you will get a full idea of what Paul is referring to about elitism.
Anyway, it's
And we
good.
have to make the world safe for snobbery and elitism.
There you go.
Let
But
Mrs.
once you
Useless
get
to
there, you
blame
see,
'em.
once you get there, then you understand. You go, oh, it's like the dawn breaks over Marblehead, as we like to say it here.
Thank you. Our host, Kris Millegan.
Well, again, everybody, thank you for, your time. What Bruce read there, what I put in is some people call the Native American 10 Commandments. Okay. And one thing you notice in there, they weren't telling you not to do things. Okay. They were expressing what you should do. The reality is, and we've known that since, well, people have known it for a long time, but it was very much impressed upon us once, they sent back a picture from outer space of our blue ball. Okay. It's just one blue ball. Okay. And all of us are on it. And every day there gets to be a few more of us. Okay. So, we need to learn how to live together and, take care of our brothers and sisters. It's really quite simple, how to act, but, what do you do when somebody comes at you, with negativity and bully, pushing you in your face? What are you going to do? Because that's really, at the end of the day, the only actions that we have control over is what we ourselves do.
Mhm.
And so thank you again very much for attending, and onwards to a better future for our children.
Thank
Kris,
you.
can we go 2 or 3 minutes into overtime?
Go for it.
If Alana Hartsock would like 2 or 3 minutes for final thoughts, Alana Hartsock, you must unmute to answer my question.
This is really scary. Suddenly 3 minutes for me to what? I mean, I'll just go with what I just wrote in chat. Kris put that beautiful Native American poetry, and I said it talked about attuning to the rhythms of nature, and I wrote, very well said, but if you have no nature to attune to. And when I left home and I lived in apartment buildings in big cities, and I was gasping to survive on concrete and asphalt and nothing, no place to garden or really be in nature with my children, I was going almost psychotic. So fortunately, I moved back home. I have a yard. I have a few acres. I am so happy. I have nature all around me. I've seen the beautiful yellow and blue birds today. It's all the difference psychologically and spiritually, having actual real access to nature. So, I mean, this is what we mean by terms of health and wholeness. It's wholeness with each other as one human family, is wholeness with our planet. It is the Native American perspective of unity consciousness. But to get there, we're going to have to go through the mechanisms we have and rewind it quite a bit. It would be beautiful if everybody loved and shared the earth, but justice calls that we at least be fair to each other in how we use the earth, and that's where the tax shift comes in.
Alana, will you yield your remaining time to Ed Dotson?
Sure, I was finished.
Very quickly, justice is still our objective. And I point you to the book by Mortimer J. Adler, The Common Sense of Politics, written in the early 1970s. And Adler's observation is we can look at a society, and if in that society, the overwhelming majority of people have access to the goods of a decent human existence, then that society is probably just. And he expands on what we think of goods and beyond food, clothing, and shelter. Access to education, access to adequate medical care, access for time to be involved in civic activities. So I really recommend anyone who's thinking about democracy and justice to take a look at Adler's book. It's one of the best written on the subject, in my view.
The Common Sense of Justice.
The Common Sense of Politics.
Wow. See, I'm glad I double checked. And now, Kris Millegan.
Onwards.
And many thanks for that.
He
Frank.
knew his cue.